So thank you again. Geoff Nitschke is from the University of Cape Town. He's visiting us here in Kyoto. We're hosted by Dana Sinapaya at NXPSL Kyoto. And myself, I'm visiting from Cross Labs, and I'm Olaf.
Yeah, so I'm Geoff Nitschke. I run the evolutionary machine learning group in the University of Cape Town. So for those of you who haven't been to Cape Town, that's it. That's what it looks like. That is UCT, the University of Cape Town, the university, and the arrow is pointing to that side of the mountain on which the university lies. So I think Olaf has actually visited us, but for the rest of the evening, I want to come visit, and that's what it looks like. Okay. So these are some of the things that we are currently doing in the lab. So these are the things I'm not going to talk about in today's presentation, but rather I will give you an overview just now about what's going on. So the first one, co-evolution of malware and anti-malware. So this is a cybersecurity project, which we have quite a bit of funding for. So the idea here is we have software agents that basically automate themselves, basically automate their own code in order to attack malware that they detect on the network and neutralize it in real time. The second one is multi-objective automated product design. So this is a computational chemistry project where we're looking at assembling compounds of chemicals in simulation that could one day be manufactured as actual real compounds for new materials. So things adjacent to like detergents, plastics, things like this would actually be functional and useful somewhere down the line. Evolving origami robots. So this is at this stage all in simulation, but the idea here is we have a robot that is able to adapt its own function and form by folding pieces inwards and outwards, so to adapt its gait or functionality as it has to adapt to different kinds of tasks and environments. Evolution of social complexity. So this is an agent-based simulation project. This is a study we did with ancient Egypt with some archaeologists. So in this case, we were looking at how states formed in ancient Egypt. So basically the first countries that led to, pharaohs and the god kings and things like this. So in the agent-based simulation, we set up a bunch of parameters, which are what the environment looked like, what the households looked like in ancient times. And we basically let the simulated evolution run across like thousands of generations, which was equivalent to thousands of years actually. And by changing the initial parameters of the simulation, we could see kind of counterfactual what-if scenarios, like what would happen if you change the environment and resource distribution this way versus that way, what kinds of societies would you get over time. The one below, optimizing ligand binding affinity. So this is a machine learning, once again, computational chemistry project that was recently done by a PhD student of mine. So in this case, we're looking at protein docking simulation. So this falls into the purview of drug design, actually. So we're looking at designing new chemical compounds, which could one day be simulated and manufactured as actual drugs in order to neutralize all kinds of problems in the system in the human body. AutoFac is the last one. So this is autonomous robot factory. So this at this stage is still done in simulation. So this is done in company with CSIRO, which is a research organization in Australia. You see the reference down there at the bottom. So the idea here is we have robots designing robots for completely remote, hazardous new environments that humans have no contact with. So it's kind of far off applications like the survey and colonization of other planets and Mars and things like this. But complete automation of robotic systems is basically what that is about. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the complexity or the cost of complexity, neural complexity in brains. So this was a version of this was presented at Artificial Life, the conference a few years ago. And this study was done in multiple parts, but I'm only going to present the first part of the study due to time constraints. So it's based on the social brain hypothesis, which was posited back in 2007 in a science paper. So it basically says the complexity we see, the neural complexity we see now in nature, in social systems, in collective behavior systems, is a result of the interaction that happens in those systems and the kind of the co-evolution of individuals in that system that leads to increasingly complex behaviors, which drives in terms of neural complexity which in turn drives more complex behaviors, so on and so forth. It's basically a continuous feedback. So the idea is all of the complexity we have in our brains currently is a result of the social interactions that have been going on for thousands of years. So that's the social brain hypothesis. So this is nice because we can apply it to all kinds of biological systems throughout nature. And so one particular aspect of biology that has been studied quite a lot is entomology. So the study of social insects. So this is interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that there is verification of the social brain hypothesis in the system. And second is that there is contradictory evidence of it in these same social systems. So if we look at the left-hand side, so this is a 2016 study in a biological setting with social insects. So in this case, they found verification of the social brain hypothesis. So the ants colonies, in this case, were actually evolving, much like my hypothesis said, increasingly complex neural structures as a result of the interactions that were happening. So we're talking about cooperative interactions to like defend the nest, to gather resources, to collectively construct things. And this in turn drove social complexity, which drove neural complexity in these systems. But on the other side, we have very similar collective behaviors. So we have all the same complexity in the collective behaviors for resource gathering, for collective construction, for collective defense of the nests and things like this. But we saw a relatively simple, complex neural structure merge in the individuals throughout the colony. So it's not just in biology that we see this, but we also see this in evolutionary robotics studies as well. So this talk is basically about using evolutionary robotics as a simulation, experimental simulation platform in order to test all kinds of biological hypotheses. And the social brain hypothesis is one of those. So evolutionary robotics is really nice. So unlike biologists who go out in the field and set up these very complex experiments that are fail relatively easy, evolutionary robotics, you can set up all kinds of simulation systems. You don't have to do it with real robots, and then you can adapt and change parameters, and you can see how the system runs. So in this case, how neural complexity evolves basically on some simulation starting settings or parameters. So that's the final point you see there. So the study is called motivation, is the general lack of understanding of basically how neural complexity emerges. So in this case, we're looking at the environmental conditions that potentially lead to neural complexity. So the second point you see there, does the social brain hypothesis hold? So we're using evolutionary collective robotics to examine some experimental setting to see whether the social brain hypothesis does hold or not. But the first point is kind of the experimental focus or objective, if you like. So to evaluate the impact of fitness costs on neural complexity. So the idea here is that, of course, to run a brain in biology, there is some kind of fitness cost. There is an energy cost. There is a fitness cost of some time. So our brains, for example, are extremely expensive to run. So we need a lot of resources in order just to maintain the complexity that we have now. So can we have some kind of surrogate for a fitness cost in our evolutionary robotics simulation and say that, okay, we have this, and what kind of neural complexity emerges? And does it support the social brain hypothesis? So the experimental setup is actually quite simple, and it's what you see on the screen. So we're looking at a collective behavior task. So that just means cooperative behavior is needed between the simulated agents there to be there. Surrogates or equivalents of the social insects in biology. So the task is just collective gathering. So if you look on the right-hand side here of the screen of the slide, you see a gathering zone down the bottom, and you'll see kind of 3 different object types labeled 1, 2, 3 there. So 1 is the smallest object. The idea here is that individuals can basically grab this object and push it by themselves into the gathering zone. They don't need any help. Object 2 is slightly bigger, more cumbersome. So 2 individuals are needed to cooperatively push the object into the gathering zone. And object 3 is the largest, it's the most heavy or the heaviest. So it needs 3 individuals in order to push it. So varying degrees of cooperation are needed to accomplish the task. So this is nice because we can actually tune the complexity of the environment. So for example, if the environment only contains object type 3, that's a pretty difficult task because you always need 3 individuals to push all of the objects into the gathering zone. But if you only have objects of type 1, that's a pretty easy task. So everyone can basically work independently by themselves and just push everything. So this experiment setting was selected so we can just purposely tune the complexity of the environment. So that's what you see there. That's the second point. The other point, which is just above, is Behavior-Morphology Co-evolution. Homogeneous robot team, so everyone is the same. That means they all have the same behavior and morphology, which is just body, in terms of the study. And it's co-evolution, right? So in this terms, and that means the behavior is changing, but also their body changes as a result of evolution, which we'll get to in a moment. And so the final thing is we're just evaluating the trade-off between neural complexity. The neural complexity produces a behavior, and the task performance of that behavior versus environmental complexity. So basically, what environmental complexity leads to what neural complexity to what behavior, if you want to look at it like that. So body-brain evolution. So following on from our biological inspiration, the whole idea here is we have a neural complexity, which is a result of the encapsulation of the embodiment in a specific body. And so the two are tightly coupled together. So that's why we selected body-brain evolution. The metric for neural complexity I'll get to, but it's nothing very complex. It's just a function of a number of connections in the simulated brain in the neural network. So in terms of how we actually implement a function, the cost function on neural complexity, it is done with a multi-objective algorithm. So instead of having an explicit energy cost, what we do is we have a multi-objective algorithm with 2 objectives. And the first objective is just to minimize neural complexity. So we want a simple network and to maximize task performance. So we basically want to find the optimal trade-off between minimum neural complexity and maximal task performance. And the method we used is based on some previous work. So the method we use for body-brain co-evolution, co-adaptation is called NEAT-M, which previous work of ours. And this was also coupled with another piece of work we did not do called NEAT-MODS, which is basically a multi-objective implementation. And both of these methods are in turn placed or extended from a very old method called NEAT, which dates back to 2002 now. I'm not going to go into details of NEAT or what that is, but it basically is a neuroevolution method, which means it uses evolutionary algorithms to adapt the neural structure of artificial neural networks. And so NEAT-M then changes that, or extends that rather, by placing that neural network in a robot body and also adapts the configuration of the robot body in company with the adaptation of the neural network sitting inside that body. And then NEAT-MODS is something else we also plug into that, which basically is the multi-objective part of the study. So we're talking about our body-brain adaptation, co-evolution. So what does the body actually look like? So in this case, we selected something, in terms of robot, our body is relatively simple, so we can kind of just play around with the sensory configuration and not make it too complex. So what you see on the right-hand side here is the basically a top-down view of the robot. So it's like a circular robot it's based on a Compara-3 robot, and it has like 2 wheel motors at the bottom and has a whole bunch of sensors around the periphery. So if you look on the far right there, you'll see kind of different colors corresponding to the different sensor types. So you see like red, cyan, green, purple. In that case, these are just indicators of the different possible sensor types. So this is not what all the robots look like. This is just an illustration to show you, where sensors can be placed. But we can have a whole lot more sensors around the periphery. So the one in the middle shows you kind of a minimal sensory motor configuration. So in this case, we have 4 sensors, 1 of each type, and you'll see there each sensor is directly plugged into an input of the neural network. So this is what we meant by coupling of body and brain, right? So the body, in terms of, we're just talking about the senses now. So the body, in terms of senses, directly plugs into the brain, and then that elicits some kind of behavior. And it does that by basically output, which is the speed of the real motors. So you see the two motors there, the two motor output nodes in the middle. So all that the neural network is doing is it's adapting the speed of the real motors, which causes the robot to turn in some way or another and go at some speed backwards or forwards. And this is all controlled by the neural networks, which is a result of the inputs it receives from the nodes, sensor nodes plugged into the input nodes, which go through a whole bunch of weights, which control the real motors. And that's it. So what you see in the middle is just a minimal sensory configuration, but of course, is that the optimal configuration? Is that the best configuration for the task we are talking about? Four sensors, 4 input nodes connected to 2 output nodes. The answer is probably not. So we want to be able to adapt all of the sensors in terms of the number of sensory nodes, and then the configuration actually of the sensory nodes, and the weights in terms of the connections between the inputs and maybe some hidden layer, some middle layer, and then the outputs. So what you see on the left-hand side is mutation operators. So these are basically the evolutionary adaptation operators. And what we are adapting in this case is just the sensors. So a number of sensors and the configuration of the sensors. So mutation operators. So you'll see like weight perturbation. So this is corresponding to the values of the arrows that are connecting there. So each connection between the inputs and a hidden layer and outputs has some weight value. It's normalized between 0 and 1, but it can be perturbed. So we can also add and remove sensors. So for example, we could take out the red sensor there, and that would basically neutralize that sensory input node and all connections that lead to that node. Or similarly, we could add another red node just below that, and then that would place in a new input node for the neural network, and new connections would then go from every other node to that input node. But we can also adapt the configuration of the sensor. So the sensor position, so basically its orientation on the robot. I mean, it doesn't sit like halfway down the robot, but then does it kind of face this way? Does it face that way? Does it face that way? And we can adapt the field of view. So is it like a narrow field of view? Is it a very wide angle field of view? And then what is the range? So the short range sensor, it's a really long range. So the mutation operators can adapt all of these things, plus the typical stuff, which is kind of adapting weights in the network, adding and removing nodes within the network, things like that. So that's what we mean when we talk about body-brain adaptation. So we're adding, removing sensors, and by doing that, we are automatically changing the structure of the network because of the coupling between sensory configuration and the neural network in terms of the robot. So that's fine. So we have some configuration of sensors. We have a neural network placed within that sensory configuration. So then what is the neural complexity of the network at any stage of evolution? So for this, we used some previous work also, which did a neural complexity analysis. The reference you see there was based on a RoboCup soccer study, so it was kind of a collective behavior study as well. But all that we measure here is complexity in terms of the number of connections and nodes in the network as a portion of the maximum possible connections and nodes in the network, which is actually 10. So what you see currently over here in the middle figure is 4 sensors around the periphery, but there could be a maximum of 10 sensors around the periphery. And then so you would have everything connected to everything else. And you could also have, it's not shown there, but you could also have a hidden layer of 10 nodes in the middle of that network. So in this case, you would have 10 sensory inputs connected to 10 hidden layer nodes connected to 2 output nodes. So that would be a maximum of 120 connections. And so what you see there would be a relatively low neural complexity because it's just a fraction of nodes. It's only 4 out of the 10, and so a fraction of the possible connections. So that is, and it's normalized. So 0 is, actually it's 0.1. It's 0.1 because the minimal complexity is what you see there. And we did that because we wanted the robots to be functional. So if we take out, for example, all of the sensors, then we have a useless robot. It's not going to do anything. And also you can't remove the output nodes because they are the motors of the robot. Obviously, if the robot can't move, it's useless. So what you see there is the minimal complexity. So our complexity definition is between 0.1, normalized between 0.1 and 1, where 1 is the maximum, where we have all the sensors operating, maximum connectivity, and 0.1 is the minimally complex robot that we start with, or can have it. Okay, so neat mods is the multi-objective algorithm. It's also an evolutionary approach. So this plugs into the body-brain adaptation I just described. So keep in mind that NeedMods is doing two things. It's minimizing neural complexity and maximizing task performance. And it's doing this in concert with the body-brain adaptation we just saw on the previous slide. Once again, I'm not going to go into NeedMods. It's actually quite a complex algorithm. You do not need to know all the details, but it's work done by Abramovich Moshe back in 2016. If you're interested, you can look at the paper. I'll describe the, not step by step, but I'll describe the main point of the algorithm, which is you can actually look down and see second to last serial progression ensures a list of genotypes is both genetically diverse and elitist in terms of Pareto optimality. So what it's doing is it's selecting genotypes. By genotypes, we mean the encoding of the neural network, right? Which is just, if we go back to our figure here, which is just the values of all the weights put together as a string. So for example, weight 1 has a value of 0.01, weight 2 has a value of 0.45, blah, 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 blah. And so if you have 120 weights, then you just have a vector of 120 floating point values, and that is the genotype. And all the connections, all the values in each part of the vector automatically have a connection associated with it. So you can basically have an encoding of the body-brain structure with just a single vector of weight values. So the first thing it tries to do is say that, or tries to rather make sure that the genotypes are genetically diverse. So basically as far away from each other as possible in terms of the weight space. But at the same time, it tries to ensure that genotype corresponds to a Pareto optimality, which is minimizing neural structure and maximizing task performance. So then it selects all those genotypes that conform to those three conditions: genotypic diversity, Pareto optimality, and it sorts them and then just uses the sorted list in terms of, okay, these are the best guys. I'm going to mix and match these in order to produce the next generation, which is just a whole bunch of new genotypes, and then starts the process again. So there's the evolutionary part. So, but it's a bit complicated, but it's basically a two-stage process. So you have the body-brain adaptation, which produces the genotype, and then you have NeedMods, which is working on those genotypes in order to ensure that we get the multi-objective part sorted. Okay. So experiments. So we have a comparison of basically two methods. So we have the NeedMods, which is our multi-objective one. So this is with a neural complexity constraint. So we have multi-objective algorithm. So it's minimizing neural complexity, maximizing task performance. So this is the method with neural complexity. Then we compare that to a method without neural complexity, which is just, we take away mods and we just have NeedM. So this is just the body-brain adaptation, no complexity cost, but we're modifying the robot's body and brain throughout the course of evolutionary adaptation. NeedMods is the comparative experiment where we introduce a complexity cost. And so the experimental platform is just a collective robotics simulation. It's the collective gathering task, which I described. So we just have 20 robots. Once again, you'll see homogeneous groups. That means whenever adaptation occurs, every one of the 20 robots undergoes the same body-brain adaptation. So if the sensors are changed on one robot, they're changed on all the robots. That's all that means by homogeneous groups. And you'll see the robots are modeled on the comparer 3. So what you see on the left-hand side, the green figure, is the maximum sensory configuration of a comparer. So you'll see like the 10 sensors around the periphery and the 2 motors. And there is an 11th sensor there that is placed underneath the robot, and this is to detect the gathering zone. This is non-mutable, so it can't be taken away. So whenever the robot goes over the gathering zone, this sensor activates and says, okay, I'm here, just so it knows when to release the gathered blocks. And what you see on the right-hand side is the actual Capera 3 robot in real life. Okay, so here's a snapshot, or a screenshot rather, of the simulation running. So what you see in the top right-hand corner is just an illustration of 3 of the robots. In this case, 2 of them are trying to push a green block into the gathering zone. But what you see in the rest of the screen is the simulation running, actually. So all of the color coding on the left-hand side are basically sensor types. So we have green for ultrasonic sensor, red for infrared, purple for color. And so you'll see each of the robots has a different kind of configuration. And you'll notice some of the arcs are relatively narrow versus some are wide, some are deeper than others. So this is just the adaptation of sensory configurations that has happened at this point in the simulation. And so the cyan and the yellow and things like this you see, they're actually the blocks that they're trying to push. And the robots are hard to see themselves. But there's another shot on the right-hand side of the simulator. So in this case, you can see more clearly, like 2 robots there trying to push the red block, 1 up the top left trying to push the blue block, so on and so forth. And down the bottom, you have the gathering zone. Another point is that we had these different sensor types because different block types could only be detected by a specific sensor. So for example, a color sensor was required to detect the difference between green versus blue versus red. And the IR sensors were required to detect that there's anything at all. For example, there's an object in front of me, there's a wall, there's an obstacle, there's another robot. Ultrasonic sensors were just a more precise version of that. So basically, we wanted to find a sensory complement or configuration that was best suited to this task, given that we had 3 different types of objects in the environment, and we had other robots in the environment as well. Okay, so this is just about the experiment setup, so the experiment configuration. So as I said before, we have cooperation in the task, and we can tune this cooperation. So we have 3 block types, basically small, medium, large. So one robot is needed to push the small, 2 are needed to push the medium, 3 to push the large. And then what you see below is actually the task environment complexity tuning that happens. So we set up 3 levels of complexity, or task difficulty, if you like. And we have simple, medium, hard. So in the simple one, you can see there are 10 type A blocks versus 5 type B blocks. So this is a pretty easy task because, half of them, almost 2/3 of the blocks in the environment can just be pushed individually. But if we look by comparison, the difficult task, then we have 10 of type C and 5 of type B, and none of the ones that can be pushed individually. So 2/3 of the blocks require the highest degree of cooperation. That's basically how we went tuning complexity in this case. Okay. So we want to test the value of complexity. So we have 2 experiment sets running. So we have neat M mods with our complexity costs tested in the simple, the medium, and the difficult environments. Experiment set 2. So neat M, the previous version, no complexity costs, tested in the same environments. And so what you see there, some of the evolutionary parameters. So the algorithm runs for 250 generations, and each generation is 5 robot lifetimes, which is 10,000 iterations. So the 10,000 iterations are simulation iterations. So basically, if we go back to this, what happens during a robot lifetime is they're initialized in random positions in the environment, as are the resources in random positions in the environment. And then the lifetime starts, and the robots are given 10,000 simulation iterations in order to move around the environment, explore it, and try and gather the resources, get them all into the gathering zone. And then it resets, a new lifetime starts, a new 10,000 iterations begins. All the robots are reinitialized in new random positions in the environment, as are the resources, and they're given another lifetime, another 10,000 iterations to do their job. And that's what you see, the 5 lifetimes there. So they have 5 lifetimes per generation. So at the end of each lifetime, they get a task performance, which is how many of the blocks they've actually gathered. And so an average is taken over those 5. So why we did this was just to prevent lucky cases or happenstance bias. So where robots happen to be close to the blocks, and the blocks happen to be close to the gathering zone in one lifetime, this will be kind of offset or neutralized if we have more lifetimes. but just for some statistical certainty, if you like. Okay, so the results. So the results indicate that for all our environments tested, so for all our levels of task complexity, we get relatively small or simple neural controllers, but these controllers are comparably effective compared to the more complex ones. So if we look at the just the task performances, the labeling here is something to take note of. So the blue is single objective, red is multi-objective. So red is with the complexity cost, blue is without the complexity cost. And another thing on the y-axis, you'll see neural simplicity. Thus far, I've been talking about neural complexity, and now I'm talking about neural simplicity. So we did this to be consistent with Josh Bongart's 2014 paper. That was the only reason. But basically, so 1 is the most simple neural network. 0 is the most complex neural network, right? And then we have our three task environments. Okay, so not surprisingly, if you see the ones with the complexity cost, they are simpler. So this is the red at the top there. So they're all quite different to the ones without complexity cost. So you're probably thinking, wow, this is no surprise. You had a multi-objective algorithm and you were minimizing its complexity cost. So of course you're going to get this result. So if we look at task performance, we get, for the simple environment, medium and difficult, we get comparable, so these are average results. On average, we get comparable task performance between the two. In terms of, so this is just in terms of blocks gathered on average for each environment. But the interesting thing is, if we look at a breach up front of what's happening with our neural simplicity versus our task performance, we can see a couple of things. So first is to look at the different colors here. So red is in the difficult environment, green is in the medium, blue is in the simple environment. And you'll see the different shapes there. So the square, the red square versus the green square versus the blue square, these are the single objectives. So this is without complexity cost. So what you're seeing there is the best solution that was yielded by that algorithm for each of the environments. So you'll see that the task performance, each corresponds to a task performance on the x-axis and a complexity on the y-axis. So for example, if you look above the red dot, we see, okay, it's a simple network. So those are the 3 best controllers or configurations rather, produced by the complexity cost algorithm. So we get, of course, it's a simpler algorithm, but in a simpler structure that is produced, but we see it is a relatively higher task performance in terms of the best ones that were produced. But if we look at the medium and simple environments, we see more or less a comparable task performance in terms of the best configurations that were produced. But of course, the ones with the complexity cost were simpler. So this gives us an indication that there is some benefit of neural complexity cost for more difficult environments. So as environmental complexity increases, there may be some benefit to having a neural complexity cost or simpler neural network structures. So whilst we found a reduction in neural complexity, so on average across all environments, it's about 60% simpler in terms of neural complexity that neural networks or the body-brain configurations evolved to. The main result was that this neural complexity, or neural simplicity rather, this lack of neural complexity that was evolved, was basically comparable in terms of the task performance across all environments to significantly more complex neural structures on the other side, so produced by the algorithm without the complexity cost. So that brings us to the question of whether neural complexity is beneficial at all. Maybe it's beneficial only to a point, and in what kinds of environments is it beneficial. So as I said, in this study, it gives an indication that as task complexity increases, then neural simplicity may be increasingly beneficial. So there's a couple of points to point out here. So these results were consistent with previous work by Josh Nitschke and Josh Bongart, and previous work we did with a collective robotics evolutionary simulation that used the NEAT-N method. and with work done by Tom Froze's lab in Waste. So the final point is on this slide, so increased morphological complexity does not necessarily evolve with increased task complexity. So this is in contradiction to some other work also done by Josh Bongart and Josh Arbach in 2014, where they found that if they increased the complexity of the environment, then they got increasingly complex body-brain structures as well. And this goes back to another hypothesis called the arrow of complexity hypothesis that posits that complexity will naturally evolve over time as kind of the complexity of tasks and environments around organisms continue to increase also. So something else we can take away from this talk, simple morphologies can produce simple behaviors, basically, that can work in relatively difficult tasks. And because some kind of complexity cost might always be needed in order to ensure some kind of restraint on the amount of complexity produced in order to make sure, what is evolving is kind of suitable for the task at hand. And the second point, extra complexity may be bad for behavior. So this was shown in a previous study done by myself and Salvatidi, which was in RoboCup. So it's once again a collective behavior study where we found that neural complexity continued to evolve, but at some point it reached a threshold where we got negligible kind of increases in task performance. So it's only good to a point, and after that, the complexity of the networks became redundant almost, and just didn't contribute anything to the collective behavior performance in that study. Okay, so this is going back to the arrow of complexity hypothesis. So increased complexity is not always necessary for increased neural complexity is not always needed for increased task complexity. And that was the arrow of complexity hypothesis goes back to an early artificial life paper. But of course, this brings up the question of what is the relationship between evolved body-brain complexity and the definition of the body-brain configuration we have. So the results we get, as demonstrated by us and Bongart and Tom Froze, it's highly dependent upon the definition of morphology and neural structure that you have. This really heavily influences the type of behaviors you get and the type of complexity that can evolve. And also how we structure the environment plays a critical role in the types of complexity that evolve. So there was a second part to the study, which I'm not going to present because it's in a paper. We don't have time for it now. But in this study, we look at a different body-brain metric, basically, a different body-brain metric in terms of how we define the body versus the brain in a robot, and the complexity cost and measure of complexity we use is different also. So some future work. So what is the implication of co-evolving body brains in terms of the complexity that can evolve? So from all the studies that we looked at and done ourselves, there are a few key points we can take away. So how we define the complexity metric and complexity cost in terms of what the neural structure and body-brain structure can look like, and how we measure the complexity in that structure, and then how we define the morphology that the structure is placed in versus how we define the environment really has a huge impact on what kind of complexity evolves and what we get out of evolution. So then we consider, on top of that, if we have sociality. So if we have a collective behavior implementation, so we have not just one body-brain structure, but we have a whole bunch of them interacting with each other, then that's another level of complexity that is introduced, which in turn has its own implications. So with the exception of work we've done, work done by Tom Froze, there is very little work done in terms of examining body-brain complexity in evolutionary robotics in a collective behavior setting. Most of the work has been done with single robot studies. So, of course, in a second part of the study, we consider other body-brain metrics and complexity metrics, but there are a whole bunch of them out there, especially in evolutionary robotics. There's so many you could possibly use or choose from. So, and each has their own particular implementations, and each, of course, have their own ramifications in terms of the complexity you get out of artificial evolution. The two references that I've put there is the popular science references, actually. So Exploration of Avian Intelligence and Herculano, The Human Advantage. So the second one is about how our brains, human brains, evolved to the level of complexity they did, and kind of the conditions, the environmental conditions that led to that, and also metrics for neural complexity in human brains. And the first one is about the evolution of bird brains. Why that is interesting is because it is us humans, a few primates, and a few birds who have evolved the ability to use tools. So there is something in the wiring of the brains of these species that is in common, that have allowed them to evolve the ability to use tools. So what they found in the first reference I put there is a particular structure within the prefrontal cortex in humans and in some primates. That's a particular module and wiring that also has some similarity to some species of birds, corvids, and the hypothesis is that particular wirings and particular modules of the brain elicits a certain level of complexity that allows or enables tool use. So that brings us back to the third point of metrics for body-brain complexity. So how we do define body-brain complexity really determines, what we get out of it. So, for example, should we just have a metric that says, okay, there are so many neurons and weights in the system, or should we be looking at particular modules and the complexity of those modules and the connections between those modules? These are all open questions. Okay, that's it. Arigato.
Thank you, Geoff. Let's come to this generalized something with another definition of complexity, because in this example, maybe pushing one block with 2 robots is not more complex than pushing one block with 10 robots. Okay.
Right. So you do need, it wasn't in this study, there was a previous study that showed you do need a different sensory, not necessarily configuration, but sensor activation in order to detect if there is one robot there already versus whether there is no robot there. So in previous studies where we just had IR sensors activating, we found the different sensory activations between, okay, I've detected just one block versus I've detected a robot in close proximity to that one block. And they learned to correlate that if they move close enough to the robot and the one block, then something actually happens, versus if they just move to the block and no one else is there, nothing moves. So there is a difference in sensory correlation. So you could equate that, well, in this study, it is equated to complexity in terms of we need the IR sensors in order to determine if our teammates are actually there in close proximity to us in order to help us. So the idea was we need a certain level of complexity in terms of sensor complement in order to accomplish the upper levels of cooperation. But yeah, for sure, just moving blocks by oneself.
I was asking that because one of the examples you had was ants.
Yes.
I think maybe I did not. I think I read a paper that said that ants, when they're moving something around, they grab it and they just pull a bit randomly, and they don't care if somebody is helping or not. And then several ants come and then they all push a bit randomly, and on average, they're going in the right place. It's okay.
So it's actually a similar situation which happens here. So it's not like the cooperation you see here is not orchestrated. There's no signaling, there's no intention, or like that. So about half of it is happening due to evolved sensory configurations, sensory activations. About half of it is just randomness. So they're given enough time in order to try out different things, and it so happens that I'm close enough to a teammate that something actually happens. But at the same time, I need some level of sensory configuration in order to make sure that I can actually do something useful. But yeah.
I also have a billion questions. So I pick one. I guess, related to this, I feel like the transitivity is not very clear for me in the list of tasks you have in terms of complexity. So the difficulty of, the 10, 5, 0, 5, 5, 5 in terms of sizes you have. it could easily be depending on the encoding of your ability to solve tasks, especially if you rely on incorporation. I feel like we're measuring. It really depends on the metric we're using. You're using the metric, but actually, what you want to know is the set of tasks. So you really want to know something about the structure in the middle, right, of intelligence. And you're tracking something at the end that you might be missing the actual complexity you care about.
Yeah.
Another way to ask this is there some isn't it tricky to track the useful computation because maybe some of the complexity you're tracking is useless, and maybe the weights are very low or something like that, and how to and yes, that's a very large question.
Wait, so your question is about how do we know the task is complex? How do we know the task is actually eliciting the right level of complexity?
Yeah, how do your metrics of complexity correlate with actual useful complexity of the brain?
You're talking about task complexity.
Task complexity, yeah.
So that's a good question. So in this case, it was kind of very broad in terms of our definition. So it was very coarse-grained, right? We only had 3 levels of complexity. And this is due to time constraints. Of course, it would be much nicer to have a complete gradient of complexity from 100 different tasks that are kind of so we could actually see where there are changes. So we selected these 3 levels of complexity just with trial and error. So we found that more or less the configurations I showed you of 0, 5, 10, versus 5.5, whatever, we noticed significant changes in behavior between those levels of complexity. So, but we didn't actually test kind of the boundaries of it, or when there are perceptible changes between that. The short answer to you is we don't really know, because we selected these kind of broad categories and found broad differences between them. So that's why we set them up like that.
Yeah. Would you like to come closer, or we can also repeat the question either way?
Oh yeah, sure. Okay. But yeah, I had a really related question to Olaf's question. So I was wondering about, rather than thinking of the complexity of the neural structure, maybe thinking about like the cost of computation. So like, given like that particular structure, how much energy does it actually take to run it? Because like I know with like simple machines in my everyday life, if I have something that's like relatively low complexity, it might take a lot of work to actually like perform a computation like that, like cleaning my floor with a toothpick, for example. But at the same time, if I had something that's really, really complex, like an array of satellite dishes to clean my floor, that could also take a lot of cost in order to complete that as well. So I didn't know if that was something that you thought of.
So we actually did that study. And it was in a task pretty similar to this. So it was also a collective gathering task. And so instead of multi-objective blah, blah, we had indeed an energy cost. So the more kind of neurons, the more connections you had, the more expensive it was. That just means the robot's lifetime was shortened. So this is equivalent to increased battery use, something like this. And we basically found that evolution got stuck on a certain level of neural complexity. It evolved like so much and said, this is good enough. Basically, I can do the task well enough, and it never evolved above that level of complexity. So on average, we got lower neural complexity and lower task performance, but everyone was more or less about the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Interesting. Could you was that paper on the?
No, it wasn't. But I will share it.
Yeah, cool. Great. Thank you.
We have a question from Zoom. I have a couple from YouTube.
Sure.
So, okay, one question from YouTube is from Nicholas. How could you search for things to do which are worth paying higher and higher complexity penalties in order to achieve? So the question again, how could you search for things to do which are worth paying higher and higher in complexity costs in order to achieve?
I think it's related to a question that I had too, which is, if all of your blocks are worth the same reward.
Right.
Yeah.
But he's talking about this study, not in general.
I guess, yeah. Your choice. Your choice. If you can answer it in general, that would be amazing.
So that wasn't right. So all the blocks had the same value, basically. So it was just the portion of blocks delivered to the environment. Where, yes, so to deliver a type 3 block, which was the heaviest, you got the same reward as delivering. So that is indeed something to consider. The RoboCup soccer did something like that, but it was quite a different setup. But yes, no, that's a good point. That's something to consider.
Yeah, I kind of expected that the bigger blocks would be like exponential something. But
Yeah.
I have a very general question, related maybe to the first question. What do you personally think about the social brain hypothesis? So, for example, you talked about cooperation and competition. There are some studies that show that chimpanzees are optimal players in game theory, in the game theoretical sense, which would mean, okay, they are smarter than humans because they do game theory very well. Or you have octopus, which are not social but are still very smart and can use tools. What's your opinion, just generally, about the social brain hypothesis?
So I think it has value, but I don't think it itself explains why we, for example, and some primates and some birds who are all social, have the complexity in the brains that they do. And there's a whole bunch of other factors in terms of the environment and in terms of what you need to do to survive. So you could, for example, argue that corvids, crows, and rocky jays have a simpler body-brain complexity than us, but they're able to perform, tasks just as complex, use tools as we are. And so if you even see, like crows, for example, would solve problems like getting straws out of containers in a different way that we do, like we wouldn't think of. So it's a different approach to problem solving even. So I think there's just more to it than just the sociality aspect. I think I'm saying it only explains a part of the solution for all of it. And certainly worthy of further investigation.
If we can,
Let's get one other question for you.
one more. There's a couple. Okay, one more is, if you summarize in a nutshell the relation between the body complexity and brain complexity, what would it be? If you had to summarize, that's a difficult question.
In a nutshell,
Body and brain complexity.
in the study, or Geoff?
I guess this is a general question.
If I had to summarize,
I guess the discrepancy between body and brain complexities.
but wait, I would say it's the same complexity. So the body determines neural complexity. I'd say the body mainly determines neural complexity, and neural complexity then drives our behaviors according to the functionality possible within the constraints of the body.
Does that mean that if I take a simple animal and I put a lot of sensors and I make it evolve for 10 generations, do you expect like the neural complexity to increase?
I would say so.
Yeah.
And what do you think? Okay, my last question. Sorry. we have to close, but so I guess we are sort of with those kind of hypotheses. So cooperation drags on somehow some form of complexity in the body and the brain. So you sort of can offload intelligence to your society, right? And ideally you can choose between offloading it or not. So you could even do it with culture, with Baldwin effect kind of things. So you can do different degrees of that. So do you want, so in those tasks here, is that a good model to, try to ask whether you want to keep freedom or control over whether you offload or not? Is that something that seems important, or you can, or you always want to? Maybe it overfits to tasks here. Maybe it's a bad question to ask for this context, but I really wonder in general if you can keep control over offloading or not into this type of complexity. a very confused question, but
I
Yeah,
think maybe I
just kidding.
understood, but I'm not sure.
Can you rephrase it in a slightly simpler form?
so yeah. So do you want to keep control over how you offload intelligence into your society?
In terms of these experiments, these types of experiments,
That's right. Yeah.
to keep control how you offload intelligence. So to decide basically how much work others are doing
So I
in
guess
terms of your actions.
It's you're not computing everything anymore, right? So you just pay attention more, and you count on others to solve it with you.
Right. So this relates to Sender's cooperation versus competition question, right? So in our societies, we have not just us, the animal kingdom, we're constantly deciding how much work we need to do versus others in order to get rewards and resources, right? So this is a part of our of course, our evolved brains and complexity, but it's also a part of our behavior and environment that we grow up in. So we learn basically when it's beneficial to cooperate versus compete in order to maximize our rewards. So I'd say yes, it's always there in some form.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining the event. Thank you, Nana, for hosting us.
Thank you, Olaf, for all the technical.
Yeah, and thanks for the people who attended in person, I guess. All right.
This is one great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.